No one wanted the dangerous horse until the day he ran into a burning barn to save the cowboy who saved him. They called him the most dangerous horse in Montana. Wild, unpredictable, a living storm no one dared to touch. But on the night fire fell from the mountains, and a cowboy lay trapped beneath collapsing timber, that same dangerous horse made a choice no one saw coming. And nothing about their lives was ever the same again. Morning rolled into Red Valley Auction Yard the way cold fog slips into a river basin. Slow, quiet, but unmistakably heavy. The sun had barely pierced the ridgeline when the metal gates began their restless clatter, ringing out across an expanse of dust and bootprints. Men gathered in loose circles, clutching paper cups of burnt coffee, their conversations clipped and wary. It was the kind of morning that made every sound feel sharper than it ought to be, and at the far end of the yard, where the shadows still clung to the rails, stood the horse no one wanted. He towered over the panels, 800 pounds of muscle wrapped in a coat the color of storm clouds. The Percheron gelding's name, Colt, had been scrawled on his tag, but the way the crowd spoke, you'd think they were naming a wildfire. His sides heaved in short, panicked bursts as he twisted against the thin chain clipped to his halter. Every time metal tapped metal, he jerked hard, slamming his shoulder into the gate as if trying to outrun a sound only he understood. Dust leapt from the ground with each impact. A rancher muttered, "That thing'll kill the poor fool who buys him." Another added, "Hell, I'm not standing within 10 feet of it." The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speaker, trying to regain control. "Lot 32, draft gelding, strong build, needs experienced handling." But even he couldn't hide the strain in his tone. Folks edged back instinctively, pressing against one another like spectators, avoiding the front row of a dangerous show. Children were pulled behind legs. A woman near the railing whispered a soft prayer, and then, through the thinning fog, a man stepped forward. Elias Crow didn't look like someone searching for trouble. He walked with the slow, grounded gait of a cowboy who'd spent more years in the saddle than in town. Broad shoulders, sun-worn jacket, and eyes the color of dark river water. There was a quiet steadiness about him, the kind that didn't draw attention until you noticed everyone else had stopped moving. He stood alone at the front of the rail, just a few feet from the trembling horse, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. Colt lifted his head sharply, ears pinned, whites of his eyes gleaming like slivers of moonlight. The chain on his halter rattled as he recoiled. A low, warning sound rumbled from his chest, half fear, half fury. The crowd gasped and took another collective step back, but Elias didn't move. He didn't raise a hand, didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply watched Colt the way a man reads a broken fence line, searching not for what's wrong on the surface, but for what snapped beneath it. For a heartbeat, the noise of the yard dimmed. Even the auctioneer hesitated. Elias leaned slightly forward, his face calm, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. And in that still point, he saw something the others didn't. It wasn't aggression burning in Colt's gaze. It was confusion, panic. The raw, unfiltered terror of a creature bracing for pain that had already been lived too many times. "That horse ain't right, Crow," a ranch hand called out. "You're too close." But Elias didn't step away. He exhaled, long and steady, like a man settling dust inside his own chest. Colt flicked an ear toward the sound, not the whole head, just an inch of attention, a crack in the armor. Elias stayed perfectly still, letting the quiet fill the space between them. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Opening bid, 900. Silence. 600. Nothing. "All right then, 400. His voice grew strained, embarrassed. Not a hand lifted. Conversations died. Even the horses in nearby pens stirred uneasily, sensing the tension. The price dropped again. $250. A woman muttered, "Should pay someone to haul that beast away." Elias finally spoke, his voice low but carrying in the hush. "He's scared." People turned. The word hung there, unexpected, almost foolish in their eyes. A rancher scoffed. "Scared? Look at him. He's mean." "No," Elias said softly, eyes locked on Colt. "I know what mean looks like." And he did. He had seen it in wildfire lines and in men pushed past their breaking point, in the dark nights where smoke and fear twisted the strongest into something unrecognizable. But this trembling giant before him, didn't carry the energy of rage. He carried the tremor of memory. "120, the auctioneer called, as if begging someone to take the burden off his hands. The words had barely left his mouth when Elias raised his paddle. The yard erupted into whispers. Shock, pity, disbelief. "You're out of your mind, Crow," someone barked. But Elias didn't look away from Colt, and for the first time all morning the horse stopped moving, his heaving slowed by a fraction, his ears lifted, not fully, but enough to break the rigid line of fear. The auctioneer slammed the gavel down with relief. "Sold. To bidder 187. People dispersed quickly, eager to put distance between themselves and the horse now belonging to the quiet cowboy. Elias stepped closer to the pen, stopping just outside Colt's range. He didn't reach for him, didn't rush. He simply let his voice fall gently across the space. "You're all right now," he murmured. "Whatever happened, it's over." Colt didn't understand the words, but something in Elias's tone, or the stillness he carried, kept the gelding from slamming into the rail again. Dust drifted between them like thin smoke, curling in the soft morning light. Elias rested one hand lightly on the gate. "I've seen that kind of fear, big fella," he whispered. "I've lived it too." Colt blinked, a slow, uncertain flutter of his lashes. It was the smallest thing, but it was enough for Elias to know that the real story, the truth behind the terror, was just beginning to surface. And as he prepared to lead Colt out of the pen, he couldn't shake the feeling that this frightened draft horse was about to change both their lives in ways no one else could see coming. The auction yard slowly dissolved behind them as Elias walked toward the loading area, each step measured, steady, as if he didn't want the earth to misunderstand his intention. Colt followed only because the lead rope tugged lightly against the halter, not because he trusted the man holding it. His hooves dragged grooves through the dirt, scattering dust into faint clouds that hung briefly before the wind carried them away. Elias didn't look back at the crowd, still whispering behind his shoulder. He kept his eyes forward, his hand loose on the rope, giving Colt distance instead of command. The gelding's breaths came sharp and uneven, almost rattling, and each exhale fogged the morning chill like a ghost, refusing to leave his body. They reached the trailer parked beside Elias' rust-red pickup. The paint had faded to the color of dried clay, and the bed was dented from years of hauling tools, fence posts, and hay bales. Elias paused, resting the coiled rope lightly against his leg. His breath came slower than Colt's, but not by much. He could feel the horse's uncertainty pulsing through the line like a muted heartbeat. The trailer door creaked softly as he opened it, and that single metallic groan made Colt rear his head with a violent jerk. Elias froze, not startled, not annoyed, just aware. He waited for Colt's trembling to ease, his posture as solid as a fence post driven deep into the ground. A rancher passing by snorted, "You'll never get that beast inside. Needs a bulldozer, not a cowboy." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he stepped a half-foot away, opening space between them, letting Colt see that he wasn't trapped. The gelding's ears flicked backward, then forward, indecisive, as though measuring whether Elias meant harm. Elias remembered the way smoke curled into men's lungs during the wildfire at Pine Ridge, how one of his crew had frozen mid-run when the flames cracked behind them, paralyzed not by heat, but memory. "Easy now," Elias murmured, the words spoken low, not soothing but steady. Colt shifted his weight back, muscles twitching along his flank. His front hooves pawed once at the dirt, restless, under. Elias knew the feeling too well. He'd lived with it long after his last season fighting fire. Nights when a gust of wind against the window felt like a roar of flame behind his ears. Mornings when the smell of burning brush clung to him even if he hadn't lit a match in months. As he watched Colt's skin ripple like a storm over water, he felt echoes of those memories moving inside him, quiet but unmistakable. This horse wasn't fighting him. He was fighting ghosts. He loosened the rope more, nearly letting it touch the ground. Colt blinked, nostrils widening, as he tested the air between them. The trailer loomed like a dark cave before him, its metal walls carrying the faint scent of rubber and old hay. Elias didn't push. He stepped inside the trailer himself, turning his back to Colt. Not a challenge, but an invitation. "You come in when you're ready," he said softly, "not before." It took nearly 2 minutes, long, breath-held minutes. But finally Colt's massive hoof lifted off the ground, settling onto the trailer ramp with a hesitant thud. Elias didn't move. The second hoof followed, then the third. The gelding's sides heaved with every inch forward, as though each step cost him a memory. Only when all 4 hooves stood on the metal floor did Elias reach up and clip the safety bar behind him. Colt flinched at the sound, jerking sideways, and the whole trailer rocked. Elias steadied himself against the wall. "I know," he whispered. "I know that sound hurts." When he stepped out to close the ramp, he caught sight of his reflection in the pickup side window, the faint lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the sun darkening his jaw, the weight behind his gaze. He'd once looked at himself after a long season in the mountains and wondered when his eyes had learned to carry storms. Now, watching Colt's silhouette shift inside the trailer, he felt that same storm settling deeper, but no longer lonely. There was a strange comfort in recognizing fear in another living being, even if that being towered over him like a living mountain. As Elias latched the final hinge, Colt kicked once against the wall, a hollow, echoing thud. The shock wave vibrated through the frame and into Elias's palms. He sucked in a slow breath. It wasn't anger. The rhythm was wrong for anger. It was the frantic burst of someone bracing for impact, expecting pain, expecting the world to close in again. Elias rested his hand on the warm metal. "I won't push you faster than you can go," he said. "Not today, not any day." The engine growled to life. Elias drove slowly, wheels crunching over gravel as the yard shrank behind them. Through the rear-view mirror, he could see the faint outline of Colt's head, high and tense, framed by the narrow trailer window. The sight tugged quietly at something in his chest. He'd known men who rode back from the fire lines with that same posture, still standing, still breathing, but miles away in their minds. As the road curved toward Little Willow Ranch, Elias whispered, not to Colt, not to himself, but to the truth settling between them. "I don't need you to trust me yet," he said. "Just don't give up on the chance." The truck rumbled on, carrying 2 souls who didn't know it yet, but were more alike than either had ever wanted to be. The road to Little Willow Ranch wound like a quiet ribbon through the valley, and by the time Elias pulled into his long gravel driveway, the sun had climbed high enough to scatter strips of gold across the fields. He killed the engine and stepped out, letting the silence settle around him. The trailer behind the truck still trembled in restless shudders. Colt had not stopped shifting his weight since they'd left the auction yard. Never violently, just enough to keep the metal frame humming like a nervous heartbeat. Elias approached the ramp slowly, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He unlocked the latch with a soft clink, and Colt reacted instantly, his body launching backward, hind hooves scraping against the floor as though the world was dropping out from under him. Elias didn't open the ramp yet. He paused, waiting for the tremor beneath his hands to ease. The gelding silhouette paced inside the dim interior, a mass of coiled muscle wrapped in fear. Elias whispered, "You're home now," even though he knew the word meant nothing to Colt. Sometimes it was the saying that mattered, not the understanding. Finally, he lowered the ramp. Light flooded into the trailer like a river breaking through a canyon. Colt froze, suspended between shadow and open air. His ears twitched forward, then back again. Elias stepped aside deliberately, giving him a clear path out. And after several long breaths, Colt emerged, one massive hoof pressing into the dirt, then another. His body followed with the hesitance of a creature who had forgotten what safety felt like. Dust swirled around his legs. His head shot high, nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scents of new earth, timber, and the faint sweetness of drying alfalfa. The ranch was quiet enough for a wounded soul to breathe without flinching. The old barn sat off to the left, its roof patched in places, its walls lined with cedar boards Elias had replaced last fall. Beyond it stretched open pasture, fenced with sturdy posts and rails that weathered the Montana winters with dignity. The breeze carried the smell of pine needles and distant river water, a smell Elias had always loved. Colt's eyes darted from one landmark to the next, scanning for danger. His muscles tightened, but he didn't bolt. Elias led him toward the temporary pen he'd built the week before, intending originally for a young Mustang he planned to gentle that season. Plans change, life changes, and now the pen waited for someone much more complicated. The structure stood wide and open, made from thick wooden rails spaced just enough for the wind to slip through without creating noise. Colt followed, though not without frequent pauses, as though each new sound required evaluation. As they reached the gate, a truck rumbled up the driveway. Nora Keene stepped out, brushing hay dust off her jeans. Her dark hair was tied in a loose braid that swung as she moved. "Heard you brought something interesting back from the sale," she called. "Didn't think you meant that." Elias didn't turn. Just wanted him looked at. Nora approached with careful eyes, not the careless curiosity most folks carried. She paused several feet from Colt. "Lord," she murmured, "he's a giant." "A scared one," Elias replied. Colt's ears flicked toward her voice, then flattened again. Nora crouched slightly to read the gelding's posture. "Notice how he's bracing his neck? See how the skin tightens on the left side when he turns? Something's wrong." Elias nodded once. Nora circled to observe from a new angle, never getting too close, never invading the horse's narrow bubble of tolerance. She lifted a hand just enough to point. "There, that indent near his throat latch. It's old, at least months. Might be scar tissue. Could explain the way he reacts to metal. Pain'll make any creature look mean if nobody's patient enough to see past it." Colt flinched at the faint metallic click of Nora's belt buckle. The reaction was so sharp it sent dust flying from his tail. Nora slowly lowered her gaze and stepped back. "He's not dangerous," she said softly. "He's hurting." Elias let the words sink in. They weren't surprising. He had felt the truth of them the moment he saw Colt in that pen, but hearing Nora say it aloud made something shift inside him. Pain had a way of reshaping a soul until even kindness looked like a threat. He knew that well enough. Nora folded her arms. "You really paid for him?" "120, Elias said. She whistled under her breath. "And here I thought you were the reasonable kind of cowboy." Elias allowed the faintest hint of a smile to surface. "Maybe I ain't been reasonable in a while." He opened the gate and guided Colt into the pen. The moment he entered, the gelding began circling the perimeter, sniffing each post, testing the rails with calculated pressure. Elias watched him read the space the way a firefighter reads shifting winds. "He's checking for weak spots," Nora observed, "not to escape, just to know the exits." Elias leaned on the top rail. "Makes two of us." Colt paused near the far corner and lifted his head, staring at the mountains rising in pale blue layers beyond the ranch. The late afternoon light brushed across his coat, giving it a silver sheen that didn't belong to a creature of rage. Elias felt a strange tug inside his chest, a recognition he didn't want to name yet. "You planning to keep him?" Nora asked. "For now," Elias said, "long enough to figure out why he's the way he is." She nodded, her expression softening. "You ever think maybe he's the one who'll figure something out for you?" Elias didn't answer. He couldn't, not when he didn't yet understand the truth in her suggestion. As the sun sank behind the ridge, shadows stretched across the pasture, long and leaning. Colt stood still for the first time since arriving, the breeze catching his mane and lifting it in quiet, graceful strands. Elias stepped closer to the rail and spoke under his breath, so low Nora couldn't hear. "We'll get through this," he said, "both of us." The afternoon light deepened into a warm amber glow as Elias slid the last latch of the temporary pen into place. Colt stood inside, his massive frame casting long shadows across the dirt floor. He hadn't settled, far from it. Every distant sound, every shift in the breeze seemed to make his ears twitch, his muscles ripple with the tension of a creature who had learned long ago that danger came without warning. Elias lingered a moment, letting the quiet wrap around him before heading toward the feed shed. The hum of crickets began to rise from the grass, blending with the soft sigh of wind through the cottonwoods. He hadn't planned to bring home a horse that day. Definitely not a draft gelding the size of a boulder with a reputation so bad even the kill buyers didn't want him. But fate, if he believed in such things, had other plans. The memory of Colt's eyes at the auction pressed at the back of his mind. Not the whites showing, not the flared nostrils. The moment Colt had hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for Elias to see past the panic, stayed with him. It reminded him of a night years ago when smoke had swallowed a canyon and a rookie firefighter had frozen mid-stride, unable to move until Elias laid a steady hand on his shoulder. Sometimes a single breath changed everything. As Elias filled a bucket with fresh water, he felt the familiar pull in his ribs, a lingering ache from an old injury. He paused, letting the pain settle before carrying the bucket toward the pen. Colt tracked his approach with rigid focus, narrowing the gap between them with tense caution. Elias didn't walk straight to him. Instead, he stopped a safe distance away and set the bucket down gently. "Just water," he murmured, "nothing else." Colt's nostrils flared, examining the bucket from afar, as though even a reflection in the water might leap out and attack him. Elias stepped back, leaning against the rail with his arms loosely folded. He didn't push the gelding. Patience wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. He knew what fear could do to a mind that had already seen too much. A truck engine hummed in the distance, tires rumbling over gravel. Elias turned to see Sheriff Oakley's county-issued pickup rolling up beside the barn. The sheriff stepped out, adjusting his belt with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who'd spent decades dealing with the unexpected. His eyes drifted from Elias to the pen. "Crow," he said, voice low and even. "Heard you bought your draft horse everyone's been talking about." Elias didn't answer immediately. He watched Colt, who had tensed the moment the engine approached. "Yeah," Elias finally replied. "Wasn't planning on it." Oakley tilted his hat back. "You know, half the town thinks that horse ought to be put down." Elias didn't flinch. "Half the town ain't seen him up close." "And you have?" Oakley asked. "Close enough." The sheriff studied him, his gaze holding the weight of quiet concern. "Elias, I know you've been through hell. Last thing you need is an animal that might finish the job." Colt whinnied then, sharp, piercing, panicked. A piece of tin on the feed shed roof knocked loose in the wind and clattered down the side, the metallic crash ringing across the yard. Colt lunged backward, striking the rail with his shoulder. Elias moved instinctively, positioning himself beside the pen without making sudden gestures. Oakley raised his brows as the horse trembled. "That ain't normal," he muttered. Elias kept his voice steady. "Neither's fear when it's been fed for too long." Oakley sighed. "Look, I've seen animals like that. They don't change." Elias stared at Colt, watching the way his breaths came too fast, too shallow, as if even air was a threat. "Everything changes with time," he said quietly. The sheriff shook his head, but didn't argue. "You know where to find me if he becomes a problem." With that, he tipped his hat and climbed back into his truck. The engine roared to life, sending Colt into another flinch, but as the truck pulled away, the gelding's breathing slowly settled. When the dust trail faded from the driveway, Elias stepped close enough to rest a hand on the top rail. "People don't know you," he whispered. "They only know stories told by folks who never cared to see the truth." Colt's ears flicked back, then forward, cautious, conflicted. Evening crept in, painting the valley in purples and long shadows. The temperature dropped with the fading light, and Elias pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He stayed near the pen long after he should have been inside making dinner. A part of him didn't want to leave Colt alone, not on his first night, not with fear still quivering beneath every breath the horse took. At one point, Colt stepped closer to the water bucket. He didn't drink. He only lowered his head toward it, examining the surface as if trying to understand why the world inside it wasn't threatening him. When he finally lifted his head again, he looked not at the bucket but at Elias. A long, searching glance. Not trust, not yet, but something that resembled curiosity. Elias felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He'd seen that look before, too, in men who'd survived disasters and weren't sure whether to reach for help or run from it. In mirrors, on bad mornings, when memories pressed like hands around his throat, he angled slightly away, making his posture open, unthreatening. "Take your time," he murmured. "We got all night." The sky darkened into a deep indigo. Stars blinked awake above the ranch, scattered across the heavens like flecks of cold fire. A lone coyote called from somewhere beyond the ridge. The sound drifted toward them, lonely and haunting. Colt's ears perked, but he didn't panic. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stayed until the moon lifted above the treetops, washing the ranch in soft silver light. Colt had finally lowered his guard enough to shift into a quiet stance near the center of the pen, head lowered, but eyes open. For the first time since leaving the auction yard, he looked, not calm, but less fractured. Elias touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, big fella," he said softly. "We'll figure this out." As he walked toward the house, gravel crunching beneath his boots, Colt watched him go. His breathing slowed, the night settled, and for one brief moment the ranch felt like a place where broken things might have a chance to mend. Morning slid into the valley like a soft breath, brushing pale gold across the fields of Little Willow Ranch. Elias stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, warming his hands, steam curling into the cool Montana air. The ranch was always still at this hour, except today. Today there was a new pulse in the quiet, A heavy silhouette stood inside the temporary pen, unmoving except for the faint lift of breath along his massive rib cage. Colt hadn't slept. Elias could tell the moment he saw him. The gelding stood too rigidly, his legs braced as though expecting something to break. The shadows under his eyes were deeper than before, and the faint shimmer of sweat along his neck told a story without needing words. Elias walked toward the pen, stopping several feet away. He didn't speak yet. Instead, he let the morning fill the space between them, birds calling from the fence line, wind shifting through the aspens, the slow rumble of water moving through the creek beyond the pasture. Colt's ears flicked, but he didn't shy. That alone was progress, small as a pebble in a riverbed, but real enough to matter. Elias set the coffee on the top rail and leaned his forearms against the wood. "Long night," he murmured. Colt blinked, a tired, wary motion. His breathing, though steady, carried the tension of someone who slept with one eye open. A soft crunch of gravel signaled Nora Keene's arrival before Elias even turned. Her truck rolled into the yard, dust lifting behind her tires. She parked in her usual spot near the barn and hopped out with her vet bag slung over one shoulder. "Morning," she called, brushing her braid over her shoulder. "Figured I'd come see how the big guy handled his first night." Elias didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the pen. Nora leaned in, scanning Colt's posture. "See that?" she said softly. "He's not guarding his right side. He's guarding the left." Elias followed her gaze. Colt stood angled slightly away, shielding the side of his neck where the faint indentation still showed through his thick coat. Nora set her bag down and approached a few steps, stopping when Colt's muscles stiffened. "Easy," she murmured. "Not touching you, big man. Just looking." She studied him with a careful gaze, watching the subtle shifts of his body, the way he carried his weight unevenly, the slight hitch in his turn, the sharp, distrustful glances he cast at anything metallic. "Whatever hurt him," Nora said quietly, "it wasn't small, and it wasn't quick." Elias swallowed, his jaw tightening. "He reacts to metal like it's a warning shot." Nora nodded. "That's trauma, deep physical trauma. Your job now is to show him the world doesn't have to bite." Elias let the words sink in. The world didn't have to bite. It was a simple truth, but one that had taken him years to relearn. Nora backed away, giving Colt space. "You got your work cut out for you, Crow," she said, though her voice held warmth, not judgment. "But I've seen worse turn around. Fear like that, if you treat it right, it can become loyalty." Elias's eyes drifted back to Colt. The gelding stood at the far side of the pen now, his tail flicking with a restless rhythm. "He doesn't know what to do with safety," Elias said. "Most creatures don't," Nora replied. "Not at first." When she drove off, the yard returned to stillness. Elias set to work repairing a warped fence post nearby, letting Colt watch him from inside the pen. Every strike of the hammer made Colt jerk, though not as violently as before. Elias worked slow, steady, predictable, letting the horse and that the sound wasn't meant for him. Hour by hour, the day warmed. Colt paced less, and by late morning he stood near the center of the pen, chewing hay with a tentative calm. Elias walked inside with a bucket of fresh water. He didn't come close. He simply set it down and stepped back. Colt eyed him warily, but didn't retreat. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Elias murmured. "Just giving you space." The breeze carried the scent of pine resin and warm soil. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow cutting briefly across the pen. Colt lifted his head, tracking the movement, but didn't panic. Another step forward. Later that afternoon, Elias opened the western side of the pen to let Colt see the pasture beyond. The gelding didn't step closer, but something in his posture changed. A tiny shift of weight forward, as though the sight of open space stirred a memory deeper than fear. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky a burnished orange. Elias leaned against the rail, watching Colt drink from the water bucket for the first time since arriving. Small victories, quiet ones, the kind that made a man breathe a little deeper. As dusk fell, Colt drifted toward the section of the pen closest to the house. He didn't come all the way to Elias, but he came near enough that the evening light caught the softness in his eyes. Elias exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest easing. "You're trying," he whispered, "and that's enough." The last of the sun slipped behind the ridge. Elias remained for another minute, letting the moment settle before heading back inside. Colt watched him leave, not wide-eyed with fear, not ready to bolt, but with a solemn, thoughtful attention, the kind that said something inside him had shifted, even if only by a breath. And in that quiet, Elias felt it too. The sun hovered low over the Montana ridge, casting long strokes of amber light over Little Willow Ranch. Elias had spent the afternoon repairing the hinge on the south barn door, keeping one eye on Colt whenever the wind shifted. The gelding was calmer than the day before, still guarded, still wary, but no longer pacing the pen in frantic circles. Instead, he stood in the far corner, ears turning like twin compasses toward every soft hum of the landscape. Progress, Elias thought, slow, fragile, but real. He wiped sweat from his brow, letting the scent of cedar and old timber rise warmly in the air. The crunch of gravel made him look up. A faded green pickup rolled into the yard, the kind with chipped paint and memories soaked into its frame. Victor Hale stepped out before the engine fully died. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of a man who had carried regret too long. His hat shaded a face carved by wind, sun, and something heavier, something Elias recognized as guilt. He held a battered folder in one hand, the edges curled like they'd been opened and closed too many times. "Evenin', Crow," Victor said quietly. Elias nodded, but didn't step forward. "Didn't expect to see you." Victor glanced toward the pen where Colt stood watching, a living mountain outlined by the setting sun. "Heard you bought him," Victor murmured, voice rough. "Didn't believe it until Nora told me. Figured I owed you something." Colt stiffened at Victor's presence, neck tightening the way a man braces before a blow. His ears flattened, and Elias felt a shift in the air, not violent, but deeply uneasy. "You here to warn me, too?" Elias asked, not unkindly. Victor shook his head. "I'm here 'cause no one else bothered to tell the truth." The two men walked slow toward the fence, stopping before Colt could panic. The gelding stamped once, his breath puffing in sharp bursts. Victor removed his hat, holding it over his chest, a gesture Elias hadn't seen from him in years. "You remember I used to run carriage tours down in Riverton?" Victor began. Elias nodded. "Had a pair of Percherons, Colt and Braver. Best team I ever had." He paused, swallowing hard. Colt wasn't always like this. He was steady, trustworthy. Folks loved him. Braver, too. Those two were inseparable. Elias glanced at Colt, whose eyes had softened with the mention of the other horse's name, though tension still rippled through him like an old echo. Victor let the silence settle before speaking again. "Then winter hit harder than usual last year. Streets iced over. Some tourist in an SUV came barreling through, horn blaring like the world was endin'. Spooked Braver. When Braver jumped, Colt jumped too." Elias pictured it clearly, the frozen street, the metal harness, the weight of a carriage behind them. Victor's voice thinned. "The axle caught on a drainage edge as we turned. The whole carriage twisted. The The collar on Colt's side jerked hard, too hard. It bit deep into him. He screamed. Never heard a sound like that from a horse. Colt's tail flicked with agitation, his breath shallow now. Elias rested a calming hand on the fence, not reaching out but grounding himself. Victor's jaw tightened. Braver went down. The frame pinned him. Colt fought like hell, trying to get him free. Pulled backward so hard he tore the harness clean off the carriage. But the more he pulled, the deeper that collar dug into him. A low groan escaped Colt's throat, a sound Elias had not heard before, something raw and mournful. Elias felt it in his spine. "They said he went crazy," Victor continued. "Said he was thrashing to kill. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't see him trying to save his friend. Braver died before help got there. And Colt, he stood over him shaken, blood running down his neck." The air thickened with a grief that didn't belong to just one species. The fading sunlight draped Colt in a copper glow, highlighting the faint indentation along his neck, the lingering scar of that terrible moment. Elias felt a sharp ache in his chest, a memory of his own carved scar, the night a fire line collapsed, taking his closest friend with it. Victor looked up, his eyes wet but steady. "I wasn't kind to him after. I admit that. I pushed him when I should have let him heal. Town folks kept saying he was dangerous, and I let their words become mine." He extended the folder to Elias. "These are the vet reports, pictures of the injuries. Maybe it'll help you help him." Elias accepted the folder, the paper soft from years of handling. Victor cleared his throat. "I'm not asking forgiveness. Just don't let him carry the blame any more." Colt took a step forward, just one. His ears angled toward Victor, not with hostility but with recognition. Victor's breath caught. "He remembers me," he whispered. "God help me, he remembers." Elias stepped closer to Colt, closing only half the distance, leaving the gelding room to choose. Colt's gaze flicked between the two men. His tail swished slowly, not in fear, but in contemplation. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine and dust as twilight deepened. "You did your best with what you knew," Elias said quietly to Victor. "But the past doesn't have to chain him down. Not anymore." Victor nodded, relief and sorrow mingling across his worn features. He turned to leave, but stopped, glancing once more at Colt. "He wasn't born broken, Crow. The world did that to him. Maybe you can show him the world ain't all bad." The truck engine started, rumbling low as it pulled away. Elias remained where he stood, the folder tucked against his chest. Colt approached the fence until he stood only a few feet away, close enough for Elias to hear the uneven cadence of his breathing. Elias let the moment stretch, unforced, gentle. "You tried to save him," he whispered, "and no one saw." Colt blinked, slow, deliberate, a gesture that rippled through Elias with quiet force. The truth, now spoken aloud, hung between them like a thin bridge finally built after years of rubble. Elias rested his hand on the rail. "You're not alone in that." The sky dimmed to violet as the valley embraced night. For the first time since arriving, Colt lowered his head just an inch, as if laying down a burden he'd carried far too long. Dawn crept softly over the valley, a pale ribbon of light sliding across the ridgeline and spilling into Little Willow Ranch. Elias stepped outside with his jacket half-zipped, the chill of early morning brushing against his skin. Frost clung to the grass like scattered crystals, and the breath rising from Colt's nostrils drifted upward in silver clouds. The gelding stood in the center of the pen, not pacing, not trembling, but quietly watching the horizon as though waiting for the world to decide whether it meant him harm or mercy today. Elias approached slowly, boots crunching against frozen earth. He didn't carry a halter or rope, just a mug of coffee and a calm presence. Colt's ears flicked once, alert but not alarmed. That alone gave Elias a sliver of hope. He rested his arms on the top rail, saying nothing. Silence, he'd learned, was sometimes the most honest kind of comfort. The truth Victor had shared the night before lingered in the air between them. Elias could still hear the tremor in the older man's voice, the weight of guilt carved into every word. Colt had tried to save his friend. The world had punished him for surviving. As Elias watched the gelding now, broad shoulders rising with a steady but guarded breath, he felt that recognition in himself, like an old scar pressed beneath a thumb. People didn't always honor the ones who lived through the worst of it. Survivors carried burdens few ever understood. "Morning," Elias murmured. Colt shifted his gaze toward him, but didn't move away. Another victory, a quiet one, a precious one. Throughout the day, Elias kept to a gentle rhythm, splitting fence rails, hauling water, checking the old irrigation channels, letting Colt watch him from whatever distance he chose. Each hour brought a new, subtle shift. Colt stopped stiffening every time. Elias walked past. He no longer swung his head sharply toward every creak of wood or jingle of metal. The tension was still there, woven into his muscles like old wire, but beginning to soften. Just before noon, Elias entered the pen for the first time since Victor's visit. He didn't approach Colt directly. Instead, he walked a slow arc, allowing his presence to drift rather than press. Colt watched with wary curiosity, his body angled but not braced. When Elias reached the center, he crouched and drew a small circle in the dirt with a stick. "You come as close as you want," he murmured. "Not one step more." Minutes passed. A chilly breeze swept across the pasture, rustling the pines and sending a faint metallic rattle through the loose sheet of tin on the barn roof. Colt flinched, sharp, instinctive, but didn't bolt. Elias lifted his head slightly, meeting his gaze. "Good boy," he whispered, though he knew praise meant far less than tone. Finally, slowly, cautiously, Colt took one step toward him, then another. Elias didn't move a muscle. His breath remained steady, his posture soft, angled slightly away so as not to corner the horse. Colt lowered his head, nostrils drawing in Elias's scent like a question. His hooves shifted through the dirt, leaving faint trails that trembled with effort. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the shape trust takes in its earliest form. By early afternoon, clouds drifted across the sky, muting the sun's warmth. Elias brought fresh hay and set it near the open section of the pen. He stepped back as Colt approached, chewing tentatively as though expecting the food itself to deceive him. But when nothing happened, no sudden noise, no shout, no pain, Colt lowered his guard another inch. Elias leaned on the rail and watched him eat, feeling a quiet swell of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Maybe even hope. Nora arrived just as the light began to dim. She watched Colt from the pen's entrance, her expression softening. "He looks different," she remarked. "Feels different," Elias replied. "What changed?" Elias hesitated, eyes drifting toward the mountains where the sun dipped low. "Truth," he answered finally. "And time." Nora nodded with understanding. "Horses carry memory like we do, just quieter." They stood together in silence. Colt lifted his head, considering them with an expression Elias could only describe as cautious curiosity. When the breeze brushed through the pen again, Colt didn't tense as sharply as before. Instead, he exhaled, a slow, trembling breath that seemed to release something deeper than fear. As evening settled, Elias offered Colt a choice. He opened the small gate connecting the pen to the narrow side pasture, a safe space, enclosed, quiet, free from metal noise. He didn't lead Colt or coax him. He stepped aside and let possibility do the work. For long minutes, Colt didn't budge. His eyes moved between the open gate and Elias, trying to decipher whether this was another trick of the world. Elias merely waited, hands resting loosely at his sides. Eventually, Colt extended his neck, sniffed the air, and stepped forward with tentative grace. His hooves pressed into fresh grass for the first time since he arrived. He lifted his head as though rediscovering what open space felt like. Elias followed several steps behind, but not too close. The gelding wandered the narrow pasture, exploring with the delicate caution of someone relearning freedom. When Colt stopped near the far fence, he turned and looked back, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with something that held quiet weight. Recognition, perhaps, or the earliest trace of connection. The moon rose slowly, casting the valley in silver blue. Elias stood near the gate, watching Colt graze under the soft glow. There was no sound except the rhythmic pull of grass and the distant whisper of river water. For the first time, Colt didn't look like a creature built from panic. He looked like a survivor learning to breathe again. Elias let out a long breath, his shoulders loosening. "We're getting there," he whispered, "one step at a time." Colt flicked an ear toward him, as if acknowledging the promise. The ranch settled into night, and in the stretch of quiet field, two beings scarred by different tragedies found solace in the same slow, gentle beginning. The first sign was the wind, not the usual evening breeze that slid down from the Absaroka Range like a cool hand brushing the valley, but a force sharper, drier, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of something wrong. Elias stepped onto the porch just as the sky shifted from its soft evening gold to a strange, bruised orange. Wisps of smoke, thin as breath, drifted along the ridge. He felt his stomach tighten. Anyone who had ever fought wildfires knew the look of a sky preparing to burn. Colt stood in the side pasture, head raised high, ears pinned forward. He felt it too. The horse's body was rigid, mirroring the tension Elias felt crawling up his spine. The breeze carried another breath of smoke, thicker this time, unmistakable. Elias dropped the coil of rope he'd been holding and jogged to the pasture gate. "Easy, big fella," he called softly. But Colt wasn't reacting to Elias. He was reacting to the sound that followed, a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling through dry forest. Elias's blood chilled. A fire wasn't just burning, it was moving. He glanced up at the ridge. Flames flickered through the treetops, distant but spreading fast as the wind fed their hunger. He'd seen this before, too many times. Fires didn't politely wait for anyone to prepare. "Come on, Colt," Elias urged, moving slowly toward him. But before he could get close, a violent gust slammed down from the mountainside, ripping a loose sheet of tin from the barn roof. The metal tore free with a scream that cut through the valley. "Colts, you'll be dead." Reaction was instant. Terror detonated through him like lightning. He reared, hooves slicing the air, muscles contracting in pure survival. The tin skidded across the yard, shrieking against the gravel. Colt spun in panic, searching for escape. "Easy, easy," Elias shouted. But the sound was swallowed by the roar building in the wind. Colt lunged toward the corner of the pasture, nearly striking the fence. Elias's heart hammered. He forced himself to stay grounded, breathing slow, steady, because panic never saved anyone, not a man, not a horse, not in fire. The flames crept lower down the ridge, glowing like molten veins weaving through the forest. Smoke thickened, turning the golden light into something eerie and unreal. Elias knew he had minutes, maybe less, to secure the ranch. The barn, the animals. Colt. "Colt!" he yelled again, but the gelding was locked in his trauma, the metallic scream still echoing in his mind. His eyes darted wildly toward the barn's back wall. Another gust hit the tin, making it rattle violently. Colt jolted backward, slamming the gate with a force that rattled the entire fence line. Elias cursed under his breath and ran toward him. He couldn't let Colt injure himself, not now, not when the real danger crept toward the ranch with every burning second. He reached the pasture just as Colt bolted along the fence, searching for an exit, breath coming in panicked bursts. Then the unthinkable happened. A nail gave way, and a section of the old fence sagged. Not enough for a normal horse to push through, but enough for Colt. With one desperate shove, the gelding burst out of the enclosure, scattering splinters as he lunged into open yard. His hooves struck the earth in heavy, frantic beats. He could run straight into the open fields, away from the fire, away from danger. But the next sound made both of them freeze. A sickening crack, deep, heavy, wrong, echoed from the barn. Elias spun around. The old support beam inside the storage loft had finally given way. He knew it had been weakening, knew he'd meant to reinforce it. But now, weakened by wind and age, it groaned under strain. "Damn it," Elias muttered as he sprinted. Colt, wild-eyed, watched him disappear into the barn. Inside was chaos, dust swirling, rafters trembling, the air thick with heat from the approaching blaze. Elias ran to the back, grabbing for the tools hanging on the wall. Another groan shook the rafters, and then the beam snapped. Everything happened too fast. The crash blasted through the barn like an explosion. Splinters flew. Dust turned the world into a choking haze. Elias threw his arms up instinctively, but the beam caught his leg, pinning him to the floor. He gritted his teeth against the pain as he tried to shove it off, but it wouldn't budge. From outside came the frantic pounding of hooves. Colt. The gelding stood at the barn entrance, body dwarfed by the growing glow of flames behind him. His whole frame trembled. His ears flattened. Every instinct begged him to flee. The metallic echo of the falling roof vibrated through his bones, pulling him backward toward the open valley. Elias tried to push himself up. "Colt!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Here, boy, please." Another gust slammed against the barn wall, making the surviving tin sheets rattle violently. Colt flinched, muscles convulsing with panic. His front hooves dug into the dirt. His hindquarters shifted, preparing to run. Elias felt the world tightening around him, smoke creeping under the rafters, heat pressing against his skin, the crushing weight of the beam grinding into his leg. Pain burned through him, sharp and unforgiving. "Colt!" he yelled again, though the strength in his voice had faded to a raw whisper. "Don't go." Colt's head jerked toward the valley, toward freedom, safety, toward escape. Then slowly his gaze shifted back to the barn, to Elias. Their eyes met, man and horse bound by something neither understood fully, something carved from survival, loss, and the faintest thread of fragile trust. Colt took one trembling step forward, another, and then he charged into the barn. His massive shoulders slammed into the beam, nearly toppling Elias backward. Dust poured from the shaken rafters. Colt braced his legs, pushing with the raw, determined strength of a creature who'd once tried to save another and failed, who would not fail again. The beam shifted. Elias sucked in a burning breath. "Attaboy," he whispered. Colt shoved again, harder, grunting through fear and effort. The beam rolled just enough for Elias to yank his leg free. Colt pivoted instantly, positioning his body between Elias and the unstable rafters as debris rained down around them. The horse nudged him insistently toward the exit. "All right," Elias gasped, leaning heavily on Colt's side. "Let's move." Together they stumbled into the open yard just as another section of the roof caved in behind them with a roar. The night sky glowed with firelight, and smoke spun upward in wild spirals. Eli's leg buckled, but Colt pressed into him, lending strength he didn't know he needed. Man and horse stood in the glow of encroaching flames, both panting, both shaking, both alive. For a long moment, Elias pressed a hand to Colt's neck, feeling the thundering pulse beneath the trembling skin. Colt lowered his head, until it brushed Elias's shoulder. The world burned around them. But they had each other. Morning broke slowly over Little Willow Ranch, as if even the sun hesitated to rise on a landscape touched by fire. A pale, hazy light stretched across the valley, filtering through lingering smoke that clung to the air like an unwelcome memory. The scent of charred timber settled over everything: barn walls, fence rails, the patches of scorched earth where sparks had landed in the night. Yet amid the stillness, the ranch held a quiet resilience, a sense that life, though shaken, had endured. Elias stood with one hand braced on the porch railing, testing the weight on his injured leg before taking another step. The makeshift splint Nora had applied before rushing off with the volunteer fire crew held firm, though each movement sent a sharp pulse up his calf. He winced, but kept going. He had something more important than pain to check on. At the far end of the yard, near the half-collapsed barn, Colt grazed quietly inside the temporary pen Elias and the firefighters had assembled at dawn. The gelding's coat was streaked with ash, his mane tangled and smoky, but his posture was steady, head low, tail swishing calmly as he moved through patches of unburnt grass. Elias felt a knot tighten beneath his ribs, not fear, but something closer to awe. Only a few hours earlier, Colt had been a creature defined by panic, a living storm of fear triggered by metal and memory. Now he stood with the quiet dignity of a guardian who'd chosen to stay. Elias walked toward him slowly, leaning heavily on his crutch. Each step felt like trudging through the remnants of last night: the heat, the choking dust, the terrifying crack of the collapsing roof. But one image remained clearer than all the rest. Colt turning back, Colt stepping into the fire, Colt risking everything for him. The memory pressed into Elias's chest like a warm, steady weight. When he reached the pen, Colt lifted his head. Not sharply, not an alarm, just a calm acknowledgement. His dark eyes softened when he spotted Elias, and for the first time since they'd met, the look in those eyes wasn't fear or confusion. It was recognition. "Morning, boy," Elias murmured, leaning on the rail. Colt stepped forward, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, but with deliberate calm, as though crossing the distance between them was a choice made without the weight of instinct dragging behind it. When he reached the rail, he lowered his head, brushing his muzzle gently against Elias's sleeve. The touch was soft, almost reverent. Elias swallowed, feeling a rush of emotion tighten his throat. "You saved my life," he whispered. Colt nudged him again, a deeper, warmer push this time, as if insisting Elias acknowledge the truth fully. A truck door slammed somewhere near the driveway. Elias turned to see two neighbors approaching, Curtis Dunn and Helen Alvarez, each wearing looks of disbelief as they surveyed the wreckage. "Good Lord," Curtis muttered. "It's worse than they said on the scanner." Helen clasped her hands to her chest. "Elias, honey, everyone thought—" "Well, we weren't sure you made it out." Elias managed a tired smile. "Still here." Curtis nodded toward Colt. "And that beast didn't take off? Not even with all that noise?" His skepticism carried the weight of an entire town's judgment. Elias rested his hand on Colt's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the soot. "He stayed," he said simply. Helen stepped closer, eyes softening. "Is he safe to be near?" Before Elias could answer, Colt took a small step forward, slow, steady. He dipped his head toward her, stopping just short of touching her hand. Helen gasped softly, then reached out and let her fingers rest against his cheek. Colt didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch with a sigh so gentle it felt like an apology. Curtis blinked. "Well, I'll be damned. That ain't the same horse from Town Gossip." Elias chuckled. "Town Gossip rarely tells the whole tale." More vehicles approached throughout the morning, Firefighters returning equipment, neighbors bringing food and blankets, curious onlookers wanting to see the draft horse who had supposedly gone from menace to savior in one night. Colt greeted them all with quiet patience. Not a single snap, not a single shudder of panic. The horse, who once trembled at the clang of metal, now stood calmly as tools clanked and radios crackled around him. Sheriff Oakley arrived just past noon. He walked to the pen, hands resting on his belt, his expression unreadable. Colt approached him without fear, ears relaxed, posture open. Oakley scratched his chin. "That's a different animal," he said gruffly, "or maybe just an animal who finally got what he needed." Elias nodded. "He's not dangerous. He just needed someone to see him." Oakley gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "Maybe the town needs to see him too." By afternoon, word had spread faster than the smoke had risen from the ridge. Folks from Red Valley arrived in small groups, some with children, some with stories, all with curiosity. A cluster of kids gathered at the pen, peering between the rails with wide eyes. One little boy, no older than 7, stepped forward when Colt lowered his head. "Is it okay if I pet him?" the boy asked quietly. Elias nodded. "If he comes to you." Colt took the last few steps himself, lowering his head so the boy could lay a small hand against his smoke-dusted forehead. The boy's face lit up with a wonder that silenced the rest of the crowd. In that moment, every cruel remark and fearful whisper the town had once cast toward Colt dissolved into something new: respect, or awe, maybe even pride. Someone murmured, "That ain't no killer horse." Another said, "He's got more heart than most." Elias felt his throat tighten again. Colt wasn't just healing. He was revealing himself, his loyalty, his gentleness, the truth of who he'd always been underneath the scars. As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, the crowd thinned, leaving the ranch in a peaceful hush. Elias stepped inside the pen for the first time since the fire. Colt turned toward him immediately, meeting him halfway. Elias rested his forehead gently against Colt's, feeling the warm breath rise between them. "We made it," Elias whispered, "and we'll keep making it." Colt's eyes closed for a brief, peaceful moment, just long enough for Elias to feel the bond settle deeper than words. The ranch was scarred. The barn was half gone. The land smelled of smoke and struggle. But standing in the fading light, man and horse side by side, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like beginning. The first truly clear morning after the fire arrived with a softness the valley seemed almost grateful for. The sky stretched wide and unbroken above Little Willow Ranch, washed in gentle blues and touched with a pale warmth that hinted at early autumn. The smoke had finally lifted overnight, carried east by forgiving winds, leaving behind an air that tasted clean for the first time in days. Dew clung to the surviving blades of grass, sparkling like scattered glass beneath the rising sun. For a place that had stood in the jaws of flame only nights earlier, the ranch breathed with surprising calm. Elias stepped out onto the porch, one hand wrapped around a worn wooden crutch, the other rubbing sleep from his eyes. His leg throbbed faintly, a dull reminder of the beam that had nearly taken him, but the fear tied to that memory had softened. What remained now was gratitude. Gratitude for breath, gratitude for morning, gratitude for the horse waiting just beyond the fence line. He caught sight of him immediately. Colt, no longer the trembling, panicked creature from the auction yard, stood near the far edge of the pasture, mane lifting lightly in the breeze as he watched the sunrise, as steady and still as an old soul greeting a new day. Elias made his way down the steps, each careful step crunching over loose gravel. Colt turned at the sound. The change in his eyes still startled Elias sometimes. Fear no longer pooled there. It had drained away gradually over the last few days, replaced by a calm clarity that felt earned rather than given. Elias approached the gate, his breath visible in the cool morning air. "Hey, big man," he said gently. Colt's ears swiveled, acknowledging him with a soft nicker, low, warm, nothing like the sharp, panicked sounds that once tore from his throat. The gelding walked toward him with a steady confidence, his hooves pressing into the grass in a rhythm that felt like peace settling into the earth. Elias leaned his forearms on the top rail and let Colt close the distance. When the horse reached him, he lowered his massive head until it rested lightly against Elias's shoulder, a gesture so deliberate and tender it brought a sting of emotion to Elias's eyes. He lifted a hand and ran it through the coarse, smoke-scented mane. "We got through it," Elias whispered. "You and me both." With the sun climbing higher, Elias decided to open the pasture. The big gate groaned slightly as he swung it wide, revealing a stretch of untouched meadow behind the barn. The grass swayed gently like an ocean of muted green, a place where scars could rest without feeling exposed. Colt stepped through the gate without hesitation. He paused halfway across the field, glancing back as if waiting for Elias to follow. Elias chuckled softly. "All right, I'm coming." He moved at a slower pace, careful of the uneven ground, but Colt didn't wander far. The gelding matched his pace, not too close, not too distant, mirroring him with the quiet loyalty of someone who understood the value of companionship. When they reached the center of the field, Elias stopped to take in the view. The mountains carved a soft line along the sky, their peaks brushed with morning light. Smoke no longer smudged their edges. The breeze carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and the subtle sweetness of wild clover. Colt grazed nearby, tail flicking lazily, posture entirely unguarded. It amazed Elias to see a creature who once braced for every sound now stand loose-backed and calm, shifting weight with the ease of a soul beginning to heal. As the morning stretched on, a familiar white Subaru rolled into the driveway. Nora stepped out with her vet bag slung over her shoulder. She waved, smiling wide enough for dimples to appear. "Thought I'd check on my favorite troublemaker," she called. Elias waved her over. Colt lifted his head at her voice, but didn't retreat. Nora approached slowly, reading his body language as naturally as breathing. "Well, look at you," she said softly. "Standing tall, huh?" She reached out her hand. Colt sniffed her palm and nudged it gently, surprising her. "He's a different horse," she murmured. Elias nodded. He chose to stay in the fire. Nothing's the same after that. Nora looked at Elias with quiet pride. "You gave him a reason to choose." Her words lingered between them, warm and true. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, Elias repaired a loose board on the rebuilt barn frame. Colt stayed close by, occasionally wandering off to graze before returning to stand within arm's reach. The rhythm felt natural now, two lives orbiting each other with unspoken understanding. At one point, Elias stopped hammering and simply leaned against the half-finished wall, letting the warmth of the setting sun wash over him. Colt approached and stood beside him, their shadows overlapping on the ground. "You know," Elias said quietly, "when I found you at that auction yard, I thought I was just bringing home a mess someone else didn't want." He paused, letting his gaze soften. "Turns out I was bringing home the one thing I didn't know I needed." Colt responded by brushing his muzzle against Elias's arm, gentle as a sigh. Twilight deepened into evening. Elias limped back toward the house, leaving the gate open behind him. He didn't look back to see if Colt followed. He'd learned to trust the rhythm of their steps. Sure enough, Colt ambled after him at a calm pace, stopping occasionally to sniff the air or flick an ear at the call of a distant owl. When Elias reached the porch, he sat on the top step, stretching his injured leg out in front of him. Colt settled beside the porch rail, lowering his head near Elias's knee. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, whole in all the ways that mattered. Elias gazed at Colt for a long moment. "We're survivors," he whispered. "But maybe now, we get to be more than that." Colt blinked slowly, a gesture that felt like a vow. Night settled over them in gentle waves. The moon rose, casting silver light across the pasture. Elias let his eyes drift shut, the cool air brushing over him. Colt stayed beside him, his steady breathing filling the quiet, an anchor against the dark. And in that peaceful silence, on a ranch rebuilt by patience and fate, two wounded souls finally found not just survival, but a place together to rest. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. And if you'd like to join me for the next journey, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the stories waiting just around